It started with a sound no one in the neighborhood could explain, the sharp scrape of metal against wood at 2 in the morning. By the time the porch light flickered on, the sign was already there. Big silver letters hammered into the dirt like a threat. Property under HOA violation, pending removal. It stood tall against the darkness, shining under the moon like some kind of warning, and for a long moment I just stared at it. Not because I didn't understand what it meant, but because I couldn't believe how far they were willing to go. I had rebuilt this house with my own hands. Every nail, every beam, every piece of this land was mine, bought legally, restored from ruin. But in this quiet corner of Harmony Grove, ownership didn't mean control. Not when power was hidden behind manicured lawns and pastel blazers. They said it was about rules, about keeping the community standard. But that's never what it's really about, is it? It's about control, about reminding you who's really in charge. People think neighborhood drama is petty, gossip, fences, lawn height. But when you live under the thumb of an HOA, it's not petty at all. It's war disguised as civility. Fines become weapons. Letters become ultimatums. And every friendly visit from the board feels like a test. How much of your freedom are you willing to give up before you finally push back? That night, as I stood there staring at the sign, I felt something shift. The quiet suburban dream cracked open, and I could see what lay underneath. The fear, the arrogance, the rot hiding behind their smiles. They thought they could scare me off, make me pack up and leave. But they didn't realize who they were dealing with, because when they came for my home, they didn't just cross a line. They built one, and I was about to show them what happens when you push a man who's got nothing left to lose. So tell me, when the people meant to protect your neighborhood turn against you, what would you do? Harmony Grove wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. It sat on the edge of town like a perfect picture. White fences glinting in the morning light. Neat driveways lined with manicured hedges, and a long, winding road that led past rows of identical mailboxes, each bearing a shiny bronze number and not a speck of dust. To the casual eye, it was paradise, a neighborhood built on order, civility, and a promise that nothing chaotic could ever reach its gates. But to those who lived there, it was more than a collection of houses. It was a kingdom, and every kingdom has its rulers. The self-proclaimed queen of Harmony Grove was Karen Holloway, a woman who treated her pastel-colored blazer like armor and her clipboard like a weapon. She'd been HOA president for 6 years, and in that time, not a single fence had been painted without her approval. Her hair was always perfectly sprayed into place, her lipstick never smudged, and her smile. Well, her smile was the kind you gave when you wanted someone to think you cared, but really, you were keeping score. The rest of the board followed her like clockwork soldiers. There was Roger, the treasurer, a retired accountant who believed every violation fine was a personal victory. His lawn was measured weekly with a ruler. Beside him was Diane, the secretary, who hid gossip behind polite laughter and always just happened to be walking her dog past whichever house had the latest warning notice. Together they formed a little empire of control, 3 people who ruled over 80 homes with bylaws thicker than the Bible, and then there was me, Laura Bennett. I wasn't born for gated communities or cookie-cutter perfection. I'd spent most of my life in small towns and fixer-uppers, the kind of places where paint peeled and fences leaned a little too far. When I first saw the abandoned property at the far edge of Harmony Grove, it wasn't much to look at. Overgrown yard, sagging porch, shattered windows. But where others saw ruin, I saw potential. The place had character, bones, a kind of quiet dignity, hidden beneath the neglect. It called to me, and when I learned it wasn't officially under HOA jurisdiction, just outside their boundary line, I thought I'd found peace. The first few weeks were bliss. Mornings began with sunlight slipping through the pines, the smell of sawdust and coffee mingling as I sanded old window frames. I'd work until noon, music echoing from an old radio, restoring what years of weather had taken away. By late afternoon I'd be planting sunflowers by the fence, lavender by the porch steps. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Every nail I hammered into those beams felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that the world had forgotten. The neighbors were polite at first. Some waved from their driveways, curious about the woman turning an old, forgotten cabin into a home. But behind the smiles, I could feel the watchfulness. People in Harmony Grove noticed everything. The kind of curtains you hung, the color of your mailbox, the sound of your music on a Saturday morning. And as I'd later learn, that watchfulness was less about community and more about control. It started with small things. A polite note left under my doormat reminding me that Harmony Grove maintains a uniform aesthetic and deviations are discouraged. It wasn't signed, but I could guess who wrote it. A week later, Karen herself showed up, uninvited, standing on my porch with that signature tight smile. "Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood," she said, eyes flicking to the patch of sunflowers near my fence. "We do love a good garden, though sunflowers aren't exactly in line with the community's guidelines. We prefer hydrangeas. They photograph better for the monthly bulletin." I smiled, wiped the dirt from my hands, and told her I wasn't actually in the HOA jurisdiction. For a moment her expression faltered, like someone had just spoken a language she didn't understand. Then she smiled again, sharper this time. "Oh, I'm sure we'll sort that out soon enough." After that, things began to shift. Cars I didn't recognize slowed down in front of my property more often. A silver SUV would sometimes park across the street for an hour at a time. Once I caught Roger with a measuring tape near my fence line. When I stepped outside, he pretended to check his phone. Another day, Diane's dog managed to wander onto my yard right where I'd just laid new seed, and she apologized in that way people do when they don't mean it. Still, I brushed it off. I told myself it was just neighborly curiosity, maybe a bit of harmless nosiness. But there was something else, something in the air. A tension you couldn't see, but you could feel. Like every smile hid a silent judgment. Like every polite hello was a warning in disguise. Harmony Grove had a rhythm, one I hadn't been invited to learn. On weekends, the same families met at the same driveways. Children played within invisible boundaries. Lawnmowers hummed in unison. Everything had a pattern, a rule, an expectation. And though I lived just beyond the official HOA line, I was still close enough to disturb the illusion. My house, old, imperfect, unapologetically different, was like a crack in their porcelain world. The first time I truly understood how deep the control ran was during the monthly HOA meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but I could hear the faint echo of voices from the community hall across the street. Laughter, polite applause, the occasional sharp tone cutting through. Later that night, as I was taking out the trash, I saw Karen and Roger leaving the hall together. She was holding a stack of papers, her expression tight, her voice low but audible. "She's not supposed to be there," Roger said. "Property line or not, it affects the whole aesthetic. Don't worry," Karen replied. "We'll handle it." She can't hide behind technicalities forever. The next morning, a white envelope appeared in my mailbox. It wasn't addressed, but I didn't need a name to know where it came from. Notice of violation, it read. Unauthorized structural modification observed on community-adjacent property. Pending review for noncompliance. Noncompliance. The word hung heavy in the air. I wasn't even under their jurisdiction, yet somehow they'd found a way to reach me, but I didn't react. Not yet. Instead, I folded the notice neatly and placed it on the kitchen counter. Let them think they'd gotten to me. Let them believe I'd back down like everyone else probably did, because deep down, I knew something about people like Karen Holloway. They thrived on fear. They pushed because others never pushed back. They ruled through silence. And I had no intention of staying silent. Still, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't uneasy. There were moments, late at night, when I'd hear footsteps outside. Not close, just near enough to make my skin prickle. Once I found fresh tire marks by my fence, even though no cars were supposed to be down that road. The air itself felt heavier, thicker, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And yet every morning, I went right back to work. Hammer in hand, music on low, trying to pretend things were normal. Trying to convince myself that the creeping tension was just my imagination. But the truth was simple. The moment I bought that land, the moment I restored what they'd long ignored, I became a threat. Not to their homes, but to their control. because nothing terrifies a system built on authority more than someone who doesn't need permission to exist. So when Karen Holloway started showing up more often, sometimes with her fake patrol car, sometimes with Roger in tow, I knew what was coming. She'd smile, wave, jot something down on her clipboard, always polite, always measured. But behind those eyes was something venomous. I didn't know it yet, but the storm was already gathering. Soon the letters would pile up, the threats would come, the neighbors would choose sides, and Harmony Grove, the picture-perfect dream of order and civility, would tear itself apart from the inside, all because one person dared to fix a house that didn't fit their rules. And in the quiet of those early mornings, as the sun rose over the treetops and the dew glistened on the grass, I'd look out at that fence, the invisible line between their world and mine, and realize something. Peace isn't always found behind white picket fences. Sometimes it's found on the other side, where the grass grows wild, the rules don't reach, and freedom still costs you something. But soon, I'd learn just how high that cost could be. The first sign that things were about to spiral came not with shouting or confrontation, but with paper, thin, white, and official-looking. Laura Bennett found it tucked neatly beneath her doormat one gray morning, the ink still fresh, the tone clinical but laced with menace. Notice of violation, it read in bold at the top, accusing her of unauthorized modifications to her property, specifically a flower bed that extended 3 inches beyond the HOA's approved perimeter. 3 inches. Laura read the line twice, then 3 times, half expecting to find some mistake. It felt absurd, like a prank, but the HOA never joked. The letter ended with a polite but firm reminder. Failure to correct the violation within 7 days would result in a fine. And with that, a war had quietly begun. At first, Laura tried to reason. She sent an email, calm, respectful, asking for clarification, attaching photos of the flower bed in question. No response. 2 days later, she received a follow-up notice with an added fine of $50. Then came another, this time citing non-compliance with aesthetic uniformity. It was as though someone had flipped a switch inside the HOA office, and now every blade of grass, every pebble, every flicker of light from her front porch was under scrutiny. Soon, neighbors began to whisper. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others, like Mr. Jameson from 2 doors down, would offer hollow sympathy in passing. "You know how Karen is," he'd mutter, referring to the HOA president, his voice low, his eyes darting. Karen Holloway. The name alone carried weight in the community. Her word was rule, her presence both respected and feared. She had the air of someone who believed order was synonymous with virtue, and that control, no matter how small, was her divine right. Under her watch, the neighborhood gleamed. Trimmed lawns, uniform shutters, identical mailboxes. Perfection, she'd say, was the foundation of peace. But peace, as Laura was learning, had a price. Every week, new letters arrived. Each one colder, more precise. The HOA fined her for leaving her trash bins visible for 12 minutes past collection. They cited her for a single chipped tile on her front walkway. When she repainted her shutters, the same shade of blue they had always been, a notice claimed the hue was unapproved and visually discordant. Fines piled up like snowdrifts, quiet and relentless. She tried calling the board, attending meetings, pleading her case, but every attempt felt like stepping into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. It was during one of these meetings that Laura first saw the full machinery of control at work. The room was packed, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a whiteboard listing agenda items that ranged from tree trimming compliance to fence height discrepancies. Karen stood at the head of the table, pristine as always in her pastel blazer and pearl earrings, her expression unreadable. To her left sat Greg, the vice president, a man who'd lived in the community for 15 years and had treated every meeting like a military briefing. Next to him, Lydia, the treasurer, who smiled too much and took notes as though recording scripture. When Laura spoke, steady but emotional, explaining that her flower bed had been there since she moved in, Karen listened in silence. Then, after a beat, she replied in that same measured tone that always masked condescension. "We appreciate your input, Mrs. Bennett," she said. "But rules exist for a reason. Exceptions undermine structure." That word, structure, hung in Laura's mind long after she left the meeting. It became a kind of curse. Soon structure began creeping into every corner of her life. One morning she caught sight of two board members standing on her lawn with measuring tapes, jotting down notes. Another evening she noticed Karen's car idling near her driveway, headlights off. The next day she received an email warning her about unauthorized exterior lighting. When she replaced her porch bulb, a slightly warmer tone, softer than the HOA standard, the notice came within 48 hours. It was no coincidence. Then came the Neighborhood Watch program. On paper, it was meant to ensure safety and cohesion. In practice, it turned neighbors into informants. Photos of her property began circulating in the HOA's online group, her dog on the grass without a leash, a package left too long on her porch, a recycling bin not perfectly aligned with the curb. People she once waved to began avoiding her gaze, fearful of being seen as allies. Isolation set in. The community she once called home now felt like a surveillance zone. Laura tried to fight back in small ways, documenting every notice, taking time-stamped photos, reading through the HOA's bylaws late into the night. But the deeper she went, the more contradictions she found. Vague language, selective enforcement, arbitrary decisions cloaked in legality. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. And the more she resisted, the harder they pushed. By midsummer, her fines had surpassed $1,000. Threats of legal action arrived in thick, cream-colored envelopes. She stopped opening them for a while, letting them pile up on her kitchen counter like ghosts she couldn't face. Then, one morning, she found a new notice pinned to her door. "Lien pending." Her stomach turned cold. They were threatening to take her home. That evening, as a thunderstorm rolled in, she stepped onto her porch and stared out at the rows of identical houses. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and cut grass. Somewhere across the street she saw movement. Karen, standing under an umbrella, clipboard in hand, watching. For a moment their eyes met. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. This wasn't about a flower bed anymore. The following weeks blurred together in a haze of frustration and sleepless nights. The HOA found new reasons to tighten the screws. A rust spot on her mailbox, a non-compliant garden ornament, even her welcome mat deemed too large for standard entry dimensions. The absurdity of it all was maddening, but the consequences were real. Each violation came with a fine. Each fine added to her growing debt, and each debt was another threat to her sense of security. Friends advised her to move, to walk away. But Laura couldn't. This was her home, the one she'd poured her savings and soul into. She had rebuilt it after her husband's death, planting sunflowers as a symbol of renewal. To abandon it now would be surrendering not just a house, but a part of herself. So instead of running, she dug deeper. Late one night, while poring over old HOA documents she'd managed to request under transparency laws, she noticed something odd, a discrepancy in the budget reports. Thousands of dollars allocated to community improvements that never materialized. Cross-referencing past meetings, she discovered that Karen and the treasurer, Lydia, had authorized these expenses without board approval. It wasn't just negligence. It was theft, hidden behind bureaucratic smoke. The realization hit like lightning. The HOA wasn't just harassing her. They were trying to silence her. Every notice, every fine, every public humiliation was designed to wear her down before she could expose them. The next morning she called an attorney. Word spread fast. By the time the HOA caught wind of her actions, she had already gathered documents, witness statements, and even a recording of Karen admitting, in a moment of arrogance, that some rules are meant to be flexible, depending on who's asking. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough to draw blood. Karen retaliated swiftly. A new wave of violations appeared overnight. Her car improperly parked, her garden in violation of landscape uniformity standards, her mailbox painted with an unapproved finish. It was relentless. The HOA even attempted to cut off her access to the community pool and parking areas, labeling her a resident under review. Yet something inside Laura had shifted. The fear that once kept her quiet was gone. Now there was only resolve. She started documenting everything publicly, posting videos, sharing her story in online forums, warning others about HOA abuse. Support trickled in from unexpected places, other residents, neighboring communities, even strangers who had faced similar tyranny. For every threat the HOA sent, Laura responded with evidence, precision, and calm defiance. Then came the breaking point. It was a Saturday morning when a letter arrived by certified mail. It was thick, heavier than usual, and the words inside were venomous. The HOA was filing a lawsuit for chronic noncompliance and defamation. They wanted to make an example out of her. Laura sat at her kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands, the morning light casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the sound of sprinklers and distant laughter from kids on bikes filled the air. The world seemed normal, but her reality was anything but. That night, as she looked out her window, she saw lights flicker across her lawn again, Karen and 2 board members taking photos, documenting their evidence. Laura didn't hide this time. She stepped outside, phone in hand, and started recording. The rain had just begun to fall, drops glinting under the streetlight as her voice cut through the air, calm, sharp, unwavering. "I hope you're getting my good side," she said, her tone cold with exhaustion. The camera caught everything, the startled looks, the hypocrisy, the quiet cruelty behind suburban smiles. It was the moment the balance of power began to shift. Laura posted the footage online the next morning. Within hours, it spread. Neighbors watched, outsiders commented, and the once pristine image of Karen Holloway's perfect neighborhood began to crack. The HOA tried to issue a cease and desist order, but the story had already escaped their grasp. Now every confrontation carried weight. Every word spoken in those fluorescent board meetings felt like the prelude to something monumental. Karen's voice no longer commanded the same unchallenged authority. Whispers of dissent rippled through the crowd. Some board members looked uneasy. Others avoided her altogether. Still, Karen wasn't done. She doubled down, desperate to regain control. She called an emergency meeting, one that would change everything. And when Laura walked into that room, clutching a folder of evidence that could burn the entire facade to the ground, she knew this was no longer about HOA bylaws. It was about truth, justice, and the quiet rebellion of one woman who refused to be silenced. The storm had only just begun. The night before the final HOA meeting, the air felt charged, like the world itself was holding its breath. Laura Bennett sat in her living room surrounded by folders, legal documents, and her own meticulous notes. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the silence. Yet her mind roared with everything that had led her here. Every violation, every humiliation, every moment she'd been told to comply or leave. She was exhausted. But beneath that exhaustion burned something unshakable, the kind of resolve that comes when a person has nothing left to lose. On the table before her sat a single flash drive, small, and then from the doorway, a man stepped forward, Laura's attorney, calm and precise. "For the record," he said, raising a folder, "we've already filed a formal complaint with the county prosecutor and the state HOA regulatory board. What you're witnessing here will also be submitted as evidence." Karen froze. For the first time, true panic flashed across her face. "You can't do this," she said, her voice trembling now. "You have no right." "Oh, I do," Laura said quietly. "And so do they." She gestured to the residents. "Every single person here has the right to know the truth. The right to live without fear. The right to a home that doesn't feel like a prison built on your power. Unassuming, but carrying the power to unravel everything the HOA had built on lies." Her attorney had called earlier that evening to confirm the evidence was airtight. Misused funds, fraudulent signatures, falsified votes, all traced directly to Karen Holloway and her inner circle. Tomorrow, Laura wouldn't just confront them. She would expose them. Outside, the neighborhood lay cloaked in stillness. The manicured lawns and white fences gleamed under the streetlights, pretending to be peaceful. But behind those curtains, people were talking. Whispers about the lawsuit, about the video Laura had posted, about the cracks forming in the image of their perfect community. Some supported her quietly. Others feared what would happen if she actually won. Because if Laura proved corruption existed, it wouldn't just destroy the HOA's leadership, it would force everyone to admit they'd been complicit by staying silent. The next morning arrived cold and bright. The kind of morning that made everything look sharper, every shadow, every reflection, every unspoken truth. Laura dressed simply in a crisp white blouse and dark jeans, her hair tied back. There was no armor stronger than calm confidence. As she walked down the street toward the community center, she felt the weight of dozens of unseen eyes following her, blinds tilting, doors cracking open just enough for people to watch. She didn't blame them. In this neighborhood, rebellion was an act of courage most had forgotten how to perform. The community center buzzed with low voices when she entered. The long conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights. Karen Holloway stood near the front, speaking quietly to Greg and Lydia. She looked polished, as always. Pastel blazer, pearls, hair perfectly set. But there was tension in the tightness of her smile, in the way her fingers gripped the pen a little too firmly. Around the room, residents had gathered more than usual. Some looked curious, others anxious. A few avoided Laura's gaze entirely. The meeting began with the usual formalities, the pledge, the roll call, the reading of last month's minutes. But no one was really listening. Everyone knew why they were here. When Karen reached the agenda item labeled Resident Misconduct and Defamation, the room's energy shifted. She cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice honeyed but sharp beneath the surface. "Before we proceed," Karen said, her tone carrying the weight of false authority, "I want to remind everyone that this community operates on respect and compliance. Recently, misinformation has spread online that has damaged the reputation of this neighborhood and its leadership. We cannot allow such baseless attacks to undermine our unity." Laura felt her pulse quicken, but she stayed still. The words rolled over her like waves, each one a lie polished to sound like virtue. Karen continued, now holding up a printed copy of Laura's viral post. "This," she said, shaking it lightly, "is not just slander. It's dangerous. It invites hostility. It threatens the integrity of everything we've built here." Then Karen looked directly at her. "Mrs. Bennett, would you care to respond?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Laura. For a brief moment, she could hear her own heartbeat. She rose slowly, gathering her folder and walking toward the front. Each step echoed against the tile floor, each breath measured. When she finally stood across from Karen, their eyes met. Two forces locked in the quiet war that had been building for months. "I will," Laura said softly, her voice steady. "But before I do, I'd like to make sure everyone here understands something. What I'm about to say isn't gossip. It isn't slander. It's truth, documented, verified, and recorded." She reached into her folder and pulled out the flash drive, holding it between her fingers. "And this," she continued, "is what your board has been hiding." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, fear perhaps, passed behind her eyes. "Mrs. Bennett," she said sharply, "this is not the place." "This is exactly the place," Laura interrupted. Her voice, still calm, carried a new kind of authority. "For months I've been fined, threatened, and publicly humiliated. I've been told my home doesn't meet your standards, that my life here isn't compliant enough for your rules. But I've also seen where our HOA funds are really going." She turned toward the projector, plugged in the flash drive, and clicked a button. The screen flickered to life, displaying spreadsheets, emails, and bank statements. Numbers appeared. Thousands of dollars transferred from community accounts to personal ones, under the guise of maintenance expenses. Then came scanned signatures, falsified approvals, all with identical handwriting. Finally, a recorded audio file played, Karen's voice, unmistakable, saying, "We'll classify it as an improvement expense." "No one reads those reports anyway." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, disbelief. Karen's face drained of color, her composure fracturing like glass under pressure. Lydia fumbled with her notepad, avoiding eye contact. Greg shifted in his seat, muttering something under his breath. The noise built, confusion, anger, betrayal, until Karen slammed her hand against the table. "This is manipulation," she shouted, taken out of context. "You don't know what you're talking about." Laura didn't flinch. "Context," she said quietly. "Then explain why funds meant for community repairs were used for personal renovations on your property. Explain why you altered financial records and forged votes to approve your own decisions. Explain why residents like me were fined for imaginary violations while your friends received exceptions." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. The silence that followed was deafening. The illusion of control she had worn like armor was gone. Around the room, residents began murmuring, some angry, others shocked. A man from the back stood up, holding a copy of his own fine notice. "Is that why I was charged for repainting my fence? Because you needed more money for your patio remodel?" he demanded. Another voice joined in. You told me I couldn't hang a flag on my porch, but you put up a new awning last month without approval." The room descended into chaos, voices overlapping, questions flying, ears of silent resentment bursting open all at once. Karen tried to regain control, banging her gavel, shouting for order, but no one listened. The crowd had turned. For a long moment no one spoke. Then, slowly, the applause began. Hesitant at first, then stronger, echoing through the hall until it became a roar of solidarity. People stood, clapping, cheering, shouting her name. Laura felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes, but she held her composure, her chin high. Karen sank into her chair, small and defeated, her gavel slipping from her hand. The following days unfolded like the aftermath of a storm. Word spread quickly through the community and beyond. The county launched an investigation. The local news picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and corruption. Karen Holloway and 2 other board members were suspended pending investigation. Within weeks, the HOA itself began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny, but not everyone was ready to let go quietly. There were late-night knocks on Laura's door, anonymous letters slipped into her mailbox, threats disguised as concern. "You've ruined this neighborhood," one note read in jagged handwriting. "People like you destroy order," she ignored them. She'd lived in fear once, never again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Laura sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the first signs of change bloom around her. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months were outside talking, laughing. Someone painted their door red, bold, defiant, free. The conformity that once defined the neighborhood was cracking, and beneath it, something real was growing. Karen moved out quietly not long after. No announcement, no farewell. Just one morning her house stood empty, the blinds drawn, the driveway bare. Laura watched the moving truck pull away with a strange mix of relief and sadness. For all the pain she'd caused, Karen was still human, a person consumed by control until it consumed her in return. When the HOA officially dissolved months later, Laura received a plain envelope in the mail. No fines, no threats, just a single-page notice. Effective immediately, the Greenview Homeowners Association is disbanded. She stared at the letter for a long time, her eyes misting. The wind outside rustled through the sunflowers she'd planted years ago, the same ones that started this entire battle. As the camera of memory would pull back, the scene softened, the once uniform street now alive with individuality. Painted doors, mismatched mailboxes, kids playing until dusk. Laura sat on her porch swing, the soft creak of wood underscoring her peace. She thought of the fight, the fear, the sleepless nights, and then, with a quiet smile, whispered to herself, freedom was never free, but it was worth every inch of the struggle. In the distance, the faint echo of laughter carried through the air. Not mockery, not judgment, but something purer, life. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't perfect. It was real, and in that imperfect beauty, Laura found something stronger than victory. She found belonging. But deep down, as the camera fades to black and her voice echoes softly over the image of the sun setting behind the quiet houses, one question lingers, not of fear, but of reflection. In every neighborhood, she says, There will always be someone watching. The only question that matters is, who are they really protecting? For weeks, the community stood in stunned silence, as if the very air of Maplewood carried the echo of what had just unfolded. The HOA's reign, once marked by quiet dominance, fear, and manipulation, was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. The board members who had strutted with self-importance now walked with their heads bowed, their smiles brittle, their control slipping through their fingers like sand. The neighborhood, once so tightly bound by the illusion of order, was now pulsing with something else entirely: truth. And truth, once spoken aloud, had a way of spreading faster than any rumor ever could. Laura Bennett had become an unexpected symbol of resistance, the homeowner who refused to be silenced. Her story traveled from porch to porch, whispered between neighbors at dusk, shared in online forums, dissected in community meetings. People began coming forward with their own stories, the fines that made no sense, the petty punishments, the intimidation tactics. What was once dismissed as just the rules was now recognized for what it truly was: control masquerading as order. And Laura, who once felt utterly alone, now found herself surrounded by quiet allies who were no longer afraid. The first cracks appeared when a local journalist published an exposé detailing the HOA's misconduct, the secret accounts, the fabricated citations, the forged documents that had justified thousands of dollars in fines. It was a masterstroke of truth-telling that spread like wildfire. Within days, state regulators became involved. Subpoenas followed. Depositions were taken. And those who once ruled behind closed doors now sat under harsh fluorescent lights, facing lawyers who demanded answers. The president of the HOA, once smug and untouchable, now struggled to maintain composure as her words were recorded, her lies dismantled line by line. For the first time in years, the residents of Maplewood saw accountability. They gathered at the community center in the same sterile hall where the HOA had once announced its decrees, and they voted. It was a quiet, powerful moment as ballots dropped into boxes, as whispered defiance turned into collective decision. The results were overwhelming. The board was dissolved. A new community charter would replace the old. And for the first time, the neighborhood would be governed by transparency, not tyranny. When the news broke, Laura didn't cheer. She didn't gloat. She stood on her porch, the same porch where it all began, and let the quiet sink in. The oak tree that had once been at the center of so much conflict rustled softly in the breeze, leaves flickering gold in the afternoon sun. It was over. The endless letters, the fines, the meetings filled with venom, all of it had led to this stillness. And in that silence, she finally exhaled. But peace wasn't instant. The wounds left behind were deep. Neighbors who had once turned away now approached with hesitant apologies. Some admitted they'd believed the lies. Others confessed they'd been too afraid to speak up. Laura listened to each one, her heart heavy but open. She knew forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about ensuring the past couldn't repeat itself. So she chose compassion over bitterness, resolve over resentment. The lawsuits that followed made national news. Former board members were fined heavily. One even faced criminal charges for fraud and misappropriation of funds. The HOA's insurance crumbled under the weight of settlements. What had once been a fortress of intimidation became a cautionary tale for neighborhoods across the country. And through it all, Laura found her voice again, not just for herself, but for others. She began speaking at local town halls, helping homeowners understand their rights, warning them of the dangers of unchecked authority. Her story became a rallying cry. One person's courage can unravel an empire built on fear. As weeks turned to months, Maplewood changed. Lawns once judged for imperfection became reflections of individuality. Neighbors who once competed began helping each other. The sense of community, real community, returned, fragile yet genuine. The fences remained, but the invisible walls that had divided people slowly fell away. One evening, As Laura walked her dog past the rows of houses bathed in the soft glow of sunset, she noticed something new: laughter, children playing in driveways, couples chatting on porches. The neighborhood that once felt like a cage had become something living again, and though scars lingered, they no longer defined the place or her. She paused by the oak tree, its roots steady, its branches reaching wide, and thought of everything it had witnessed. The fear, the fight, the fall. She reached out and brushed her hand against the rough bark, whispering, "We made it." The world, it seemed, had finally learned the truth that Maplewood had fought so hard to bury. Power without accountability always rots from within. And no matter how small a person may seem, integrity, once ignited, can burn through the darkest deceit. In the end, Laura's victory wasn't just about reclaiming her home. It was about reclaiming something far greater: her peace, her dignity, her belief that justice, however slow, always finds its way. As the final light faded from the horizon, her voice echoed softly in the still air, a whisper both tender and defiant. They wanted silence. Instead, they created a story no one will ever forget, and maybe that's the lesson hidden beneath every manicured lawn and freshly painted fence, that beneath the surface of every perfect neighborhood lies a truth waiting to be exposed. So the question lingers: how far? Would you go to defend your home, your voice, your peace, when the people meant to protect it become the ones trying to take it away?